All right, hello everyone. I am Kate Bonder, the Director of Community Relations at Carroll County Memorial Hospital. Thanks for joining us for today's educational forum on grief and loss. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to share that this is being offered today by the Carroll County Mental Health Task Force, which is made up of several organizations here in the county. The task force was established in the spring of 2021, and the group has been working really hard behind the scenes to address mental health and substance use issues that we are all seeing and hearing about. And if you'd like to stay up to date on any of the initiatives that the group is working on, you can follow us on Facebook at Carroll County Mental Health. So it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Christy Crawford. She's a licensed professional counselor with Burrell Behavioral Health here in Carrollton. She's been working in the mental health field for over 20 years. And before I pass it off, we will leave time at the end if anyone does want to ask questions, or you can also put them in the chat box if you would like. Otherwise, we can provide you with her contact information to reach out to Christy privately. So we'll pass it on to you.
Well, thanks, Kate. So grief is such a hard topic, taboo topic, because it's so uncomfortable. So I want to kind of start off as what is grief? So grief is actually what you feel on the inside. Mourning is what we experience and show to others on the outside. So with grief, it's attachment that we feel for each other, to those that we love, to the house that we live in, to the job we engage in. Well, all this is reflected by the pain we feel later when we no longer have our job, our home, or our loved one. We grieve for those that we love, even grieve for those that we hate, but we don't grieve for those who we are indifferent to. So in a very real way, grief is an evidence of your love. Each tear is a proof that you cared, that you loved. In 1917, Freud wrote, grieving is a natural process that should not be tampered with. So I would like you to think of grief as a miraculous gift, which is given to us to help us heal the pain. Because if you allow it and allow that grief always works and it always heals. So grief is a natural response to losing something or someone. So it can be a death of a family member, loss of a job. It could also be, we can have grief with chronic illnesses, disabilities for you or a loved one, and even moving our home or country or things like that. But for today's purposes, I'm going to talk about grief of losing a loved one. So for the first 6 months after you have lost that loved one, you're going to feel like you're on this emotional roller coaster. You're going to have denial, sadness, crying, loneliness. That first year brings with it all the missed anniversaries, Christmases, birthdays, and all the usual family celebrations. Even after a period of time, we can go through a short grieving period when we realize that a loved one has missed a very special family occasion, such as a baptism, a birth of a child, wedding, and so forth. So don't be surprised that you find yourself reliving some of those stages of grief again as they come up, or even during that day of that special event. This is all perfectly normal reaction to have. One of the most important things to take from this forum today, that everyone grieves differently. But if you understand the process that grief takes, give yourself time to grieve and understand your emotions and start to take care of yourself and seek support, you can heal and life will be better again. So remember that normal grief can vary greatly between cultures, people, situation, but it's a natural process and it does not always require treatment. So there is some when they have that complicated grief that does require treatment, which we'll go over a little bit later. So the grief process. So there's 3 types of grief in that grief process. So we have that acute grief. So this is what grief that we have that occurs immediately after that loss. It lasts for months afterwards. It's not unusual to feel like you're on this emotional roller coaster for the first 6 months. So that way, wise, if you ever went to seek treatment for grief and a therapist or another provider said, hey, it hasn't been 6 months. If you're still having problems, come back. And the reason for this is because it's normal to have these intense feelings of shock, distress, sadness, poor appetite, problems sleeping. All that's normal and will slowly diminish with passage of time and give way to that integrated grief. So integrated grief. So this happens after acute grief. So this occurs when we're resolving those intense emotions are resolving. And we enter a lifelong stage of this integrated grief. At this point, we have accepted the reality of our loss and we have resumed our daily life activities. Doesn't mean that you don't miss your loved one, nor does it mean that you don't feel pain from their memory, but you've learned how to cope. Acute grief may show itself, especially around the holidays or those special events and things like I talked about before, but we're able to function. Then there's the complicated grief. Now, some people may enter into the complicated grief right after that acute grief. This is where those intense emotions that I talked about earlier are continuing. They don't seem to be going away. These symptoms can unfortunately last for years if treatment's not sought. The person who has this complicated grief, the loss that they experience may continue to feel unreal and unmanageable. They're constantly yearning for the deceased, or they're feeling guilty about moving on and accepting their loss. So about 10% of people who have grief go have that complicated grief. So it's not as high as most people would think. So because grief is normal. And in that grieving process, there is 5 stages of grief. I'm sure some of you have heard of it and it's familiar. And that's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So people often think that these stages last for weeks or months. They forget that the stages are a response to our feelings. And they can last for minutes, for hours. They can flip in and out from one another. We do not enter these stages and leave these stages as a linear fashion. We may feel one and then another, and then we can go back to the first one again. So we're constantly moving through all 5 during that whole time. So denial. The purpose of denial in our grieving is that it helps us survive the loss. The world becomes meaningless and overwhelming. Life doesn't make sense to us anymore. We're in a state of shock and denial. We go numb. We wonder how we can go on, if we can go on, or why should we go on? We try to find ways to simply get through each day. Denial and shock can help us cope and make survival possible. Denial actually helps us pace our feelings of grief. So I want you to think of that stage of denial as a grace. It's nature's way of letting you handle as much as you can handle. As you accept the reality of that loss and start to ask yourself questions, you are unknowingly beginning the healing process. You're becoming stronger and the denial is beginning to fade. But as you proceed, all these feelings you were denying begin to surface. Then there's anger. Anger is a necessary stage of the healing process. We must be willing to feel our anger, even though it seems endless. The more you truly feel it, the more it will begin to dissipate and the more you will heal. There are many other emotions under anger, and you'll get to them in time, but anger is that emotion that we are most used to managing and more comfortable feeling out of those distressing emotions. The truth is that anger has no limits. It can be extended to your friends, the doctors, your family, yourself, your loved one who died, but also could be to God or any other spiritual factor. So you may ask questions like, where is God in this? Underneath that anger is pain. It's natural to feel deserted and abandoned, but we live in a society that fears anger. Anger is a strength and it can be an anchor, giving temporary structure to that nothingness of that loss. So at first, grief feels like you're being lost at sea. You don't have a connection to anything. Then you get angry at someone. And it could be even a small little thing, maybe, or it could be something bigger. It could be all different kinds of things, like the person didn't attend the funeral, maybe a person who isn't around, maybe a person who is different now that your loved one has died. So that anger has suddenly given you structure. You're angry towards them. That anger becomes a bridge over that open sea, a connection for you to them. So it is something that to hold on to. And that connection is made from that strength of that anger, which makes you feel better than feeling nothing. We usually know more about suppressing anger than feeling it. And that anger is just another indication of that intensity of your love. Then comes bargaining. So before a loss, it seems like you'll do anything if your loved one would be spared. So you may do some bargaining like, please God, if you, or I'll never be angry at my wife again if you just let her live. After a loss, a bargaining may take the form of a temporary truce. What if I devote the rest of my life to helping others? Then I can wake up and realize this has all just been a bad dream. We become lost in the maze of if onlys or what if statements. We want our life back to the way it was. We want our loved one restored. We want to go back in time. We want to find that tumor sooner, recognize that illness more quickly, stop that accident from happening. We have if onlys, if onlys, if onlys. And with bargaining comes guilt. They are companions in this. Those if only statements cause us to find fault in ourselves and what we think we could have done differently. We may even bargain with the pain. We will do anything not to feel the pain of this loss. We may remain in the past, try to negotiate our way out of that hurt. Then depression. So after bargaining, our attention moves squarely into the present. These empty feelings present themselves and grief enters our lives on a deeper level, deeper than we've ever imagined. This depressive stage feels as though it will last forever. So it's important to understand that this depression is not a sign of mental illness. It is an appropriate response to a great loss. It is normal. We withdraw from life. We let in a fog of intense sadness, wondering perhaps wonder if there's any point of going on alone or why go on at all. Depression after a loss is too often seen as unnatural, a state to be fixed, something to snap out of. As a society, we're always constantly moving and going. But depression is normal with grief. So the first question to ask yourself is whether or not the situation you're in is actually depressing. That loss of a loved one is a very depressing situation, and that depression is normal and appropriate response. To not experience depression of a loved one when they die would be kind of unusual. That's something normal we would expect. So when a loss fully settles in your soul and that realization of your loved one didn't get better this time and it's not coming back, is understandably depressing. So if a grief process of healing, then depression is one of the many necessary steps along the way. Then the last one is acceptance. Acceptance is often confused with the notion of, I'm all right, or I'm okay with what happened. This is not the case. Acceptance means that you don't ever feel okay or right about the loss of your loved one. What you're doing is that you accepted the reality that your loved one is no longer here and they're gone, and recognizing that this is your new reality. We'll never like this reality or make it okay, but we'll eventually accept it and we'll learn to live with it. So we're coming to our new norm, which we must learn to live. So we must try to live now in the world where our loved one is missing and resisting this new norm. At first, many people want to maintain a life as it was before the loved one died. In time, though, bits and pieces of acceptance, however, we see that cannot be maintained in that past intact. So we are forced to change and we must readjust. We must learn to reorganize our roles, reassign them to others, or take them on ourselves. Finding acceptance may be just having more good days than bad days. And as we begin to live again and enjoy our life, we often feel that in doing so, we're betraying our loved one. We can never replace what has been lost, but we can make new connections, new meaningful relationships, and new interdependencies. So instead of denying our feelings, we listen to our needs, we move on, we change, we grow, we evolve. We start to reach out to others and become involved in their lives. We invest in our friendships and our relationships with ourselves. We begin to live again, but we cannot do so until we have given grief its time. With complicated grief, it is everything that I talked about with that acute grief. But with complicated grief, those emotions are so intense and we're so focused on our grief that we are incapacitated. We're no longer able to function daily. And this occurs after 6 months, the death of a loved one. If we're stuck in our grief process, and it is that complicated grief, we're ruminating about the death and the longing for reunion with our loved one. We're have identity confusion. What are we now since I've lost my loved one? We're having intense feelings of emptiness or loneliness. We're having recurrent thoughts of life is meaningless or unfair without that loved one. We have frequent urges to join them, feelings of shock, maybe some numbness, stunned since the loved one's death. Maybe we have that inability to accept their loss. We have no pleasure in doing things. We're angry or we're bitter. We're experiencing the pain that the deceased suffered, or we're hearing and seeing the deceased. And now this is only concerning if it's not part of your culture or your belief system. We're having intense reactions to memories or reminders of our loved one. We could be avoiding of any reminders of our loved one, or we could be the opposite, actively seeking out reminders so we can feel close to them. We have difficulties trusting others, and we're feeling like we're stuck. We just can't move on in that grief process. These symptoms occur every day. They're causing so much distress and functional impairment that you just can't do anything. You're not eating, maybe you're not sleeping, you're doing nothing. And because it's so hard because you're stuck in that grief process. Also, individuals who are stuck in this grieving process of that complicated grief, they report loss of self-worth or a sense of self. They feel emotionally disconnected from others and do not wish to move forward with their grief. Sometimes they feel like if they do move forward with their grief, that they are betraying that loved one. But again, like I mentioned earlier, only 10% of people actually go into that complicated grief, which doesn't occur until after 6 months of the loss of that loved one. So how do we take care of ourselves during these times of grief? Because like I said at the beginning, everyone grieves differently. There is no right way to grieve, but we want to take care of ourselves in this time. So first one is we want to seek and accept support. You cannot travel this path alone. You need the support and care of others. Call on a trusted family member, a friend, your church, whoever that you trust. 2, accept your grief. Don't try to run and hide from your grief. We need to experience that pain and sorrow so we're able to move past it and on toward that healing process. Find role models. You're not the first person to travel this road of grief. It may feel like it at times, but you're not. So discover how others have coped with the loss before you. This will provide you the model to base your own healing on and remind you that you're not alone in this process. There are, if you don't know anyone, feel comfortable reaching out this time. There's also books on grief. There's support groups. There's different things that can help you through this time. Learn about grief. The more you learn about grief and dispel the myths surrounding it, the more you'll realize that your grief is normal. You may also discover your grief is complicated and that you need more help to cope. Either way, knowledge is power. Express your grief. Grief cannot stay hidden deep within you. The best way to work through your grief is to let it out. So if you want to cry, cry. If you want to scream at the top of your lungs and yell, if you need it, by golly, do it. Express your feelings through music, art, poetry, or journaling. Whether you express your grief with a safe person you trust or let it out in complete privacy, it doesn't matter. Expressing your feelings is the only way to honor your grief and to begin to work through it. Accept your feelings. Grief can bring on many different feelings to the surface, and some are very, very intense. Acknowledge these feelings and accept them as part of the natural grieving process. Don't hold in that anger, that sadness, or that longing. These are important feelings that, once expressed, will help you heal. Pace yourself. Grief can be exhausting. Emotions are exhausting, and you're experiencing these very intensely. And so you're going to be exhausted. So it takes a lot of energy to feel so intensely. So allow yourself plenty of time to do everyday activities and don't overschedule yourself. Rest when you need it. Offer yourself some grace. Reach out to the support if you're needing it. Get involved in something. So getting involved in work or some other activity you enjoy can keep you focused and offer a welcome distraction from your grief. If that activity is especially meaningful or helpful to others, you may find it also raises your spirits. Have a little fun. Sometimes grieving people won't allow themselves to have fun, as if sharing a laugh with someone is somehow dishonoring their memory of their loved one. The truth is, laughter is an excellent medicine. A great way to have some genuine fun is to surround yourself with children or animals or just anybody that makes you laugh. And keep the faith. Remember that intense grief doesn't last forever. One of my favorite sayings goes, faith is not absence of fear, but the willingness to go on when fear is present. So keep the faith that you will one day heal and be whole again. So some things that you can do, I will send this to Kate. I have a list of some resources. So there's a link for the 26 best books on grief that was published, nominated in 2022. I also have some free little journal hand workbooks that deal with grief and bereavement and just coping with the death of a loved one. I even have one that just that is targeted for children too. So how do they cope with the death of a loved one? There's 10 strategies for coping with grief, and plus just some activities like scrapbooking, creating a memory box, writing a acrostic poem, the name of your loved one, and creating a poem with the letter of their name. Also, the holidays are coming, and this is a tough time when we're grieving someone that we love. So incorporate your loved one into the holiday. So whether it's making sure you're fixing a favorite dish or having a special ornament on the tree if you celebrate Christmas, or whatever your beliefs and traditions are, incorporate that loved one into that holiday. Talk about the good memories and the funny things they do. And this is all will help you with that grieving process for yourself and the others that are grieving with you during these times. And that's all I have.
I got a question for you, Christy. What kind of treatment options are out there for those who are dealing with complicated grief?
So you can have individual counseling. So you can either do that through your pastor if you attend a church. You can do it from individual therapist, and there's also group therapy to work through that grief too.
I was wondering about, you said you had a kid's book geared towards grief. What is the age range on that?
Hold on, let me click on the link. I don't remember, Cody, off the top of my head. I do have several different things actually. So if this one does not work, I have even younger. So this one is dealing with so the one I have shared here is mainly for parents to help their children grieve, but I do have in my own resources, one for children, and I have one for teenagers. I have one for small children, like little bitties that are more toddler, kindergarten, first grade range, and I have regular just children. So I'll include all three of those too.
Appreciate it. This one, he's 16.
Okay. So yeah, I have several for targeted towards teenagers, several things.
Perfect. I appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem.
Thank you.
Christy, oftentimes individuals only get a few days of bereavement leave after a loss. Are there any like small coping skills that you would suggest for those who have to like return to their daily work routine, even when they're not feeling ready?
Yes. So, one thing to do is know that it's okay to disengage from work, to take a time out, meaning that, and letting others know that you need a few minutes, because they're going to understand that this is going to be a difficult time for you. So don't hesitate to let them know that, hey, I need a timeout. And everything. Also, doing something that having like a prepared statement. So if you don't want to talk about it with your work colleagues, just already kind of having a planned prepared statement, like, thank you for the support. I don't want to talk about it right now. So just kind of having that so that you're not put on the spot moment when you do return to work. That's helpful. Taking care of yourself, making sure you get sleep, that you're eating, and all, those self-care needs are going to be really vital if you do have to return to work. And recognizing that it's okay. You're not going to be on the top of your game like you were before, and being okay with that. And others are going to be more accepting of that too. So don't be so critical of yourself during this time. It's hard, and everybody knows it's hard. So, and if you need more time, don't hesitate to ask too. There are options to with work, FMLA and different things like that to use to extend that time for you at home.
I don't think we have any questions in the chat. Anybody else have any other questions for Christy? Well, thank you very much for your time.
Yes. Thanks. I think this is great. Talking about since a hard topic to talk about at times, and a lot of people feel lost when it comes to grief. And if anybody has any questions later or anything like that, I'm more than happy to speak with them. So.
Great. Thanks, Christy. I know I'm sure we'll share your contact info. And I was just thinking too, one of our initiatives with our mental health task force has been the 988 crisis line. And so just thought I'd remind everyone that if you're feeling in crisis or you need someone to talk to, you can always call that 988 number.
Absolutely.